The laughter started loud and deliberate, designed to humiliate, as flight attendant Rebecca Morrison gestured toward the three black women sitting together in first-class seats 1A, 1B, and 1C, her voice carrying through the cabin with theatrical mockery. "Ladies, I'm going to need to see proof of payment for these seats because, frankly, I find it hard to believe that all three of you independently purchased first-class tickets on the same flight. This looks more like someone figured out how to game our system, or maybe you're using miles that don't actually belong to you." The three women looked up from their conversation, and 45-year-old Natasha Williams felt the familiar exhaustion settle over her as she recognized what was happening. The specific quality of contempt that came from someone who'd looked at three black women traveling together and decided they must be cheating or lying because their presence in premium cabins didn't match whatever mental model Rebecca carried about who belonged in first class. Beside Natasha sat her business partners, 52-year-old Dr. Carmen Rodriguez and 48-year-old Angela Chen, and all three women exchanged glances that communicated years of shared experiences navigating spaces where their competence and legitimacy were constantly questioned, where their achievements were always assumed to be less than they actually were, where their presence triggered suspicion rather than the courtesy extended to white passengers who boarded without their tickets being scrutinized or their right to be there interrogated. Natasha pulled out her boarding pass with hands that remained perfectly steady through decades of practice at controlling her reactions to microaggressions and overt racism, and she held it up so Rebecca could see the clear first-class designation. "We all have valid tickets that we purchased with our own money. We're traveling together for a business meeting, and I'm not sure why you're questioning our legitimacy when I've watched you serve at least 6 other first-class passengers without asking them to prove they paid for their seats." Rebecca barely glanced at the boarding pass before waving it away with a dismissive gesture that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just following security protocols to ensure all passengers are in their correct seats. Sometimes people get confused about upgrades or complimentary tickets, and I have a responsibility to verify that everyone in this cabin has legitimate access. Now, if you could just provide some additional documentation, like credit card receipts or confirmation emails, we can clear this up quickly and get back to our service." The condescension dripped from every word, the implication that these three professional women needed to prove themselves in ways that other passengers didn't. And Natasha saw Angela's jaw tighten in the way it always did when she was fighting to maintain composure in the face of disrespect that shouldn't have to be tolerated, but that all three of them had learned came with the territory of being successful black and brown women in a world that constantly demanded they justify their achievements. Dr. Rodriguez, whose credentials included a Ph.D. in aerospace engineering and 15 years at NASA before transitioning to private industry, pulled up her airline app showing her executive platinum status, and she spoke in the calm professorial tone she'd perfected during years of explaining complex concepts to people who underestimated her intelligence based on her appearance. "I've been executive platinum with this airline for 12 consecutive years. I've flown over 2 million miles, and I've never once been asked to provide receipts to prove I paid for my seat. So I'm curious about what specific aspect of our presence has triggered this unprecedented security concern." Rebecca's face flushed, but instead of backing down, she doubled down with the kind of defensive aggression people deploy when they've been caught doing something wrong but refuse to acknowledge it. "I don't appreciate your tone, ma'am. I'm simply doing my job, and if you three are going to be difficult about basic verification procedures, then perhaps first class isn't the right environment for you. We have standards to maintain, and passengers who can't cooperate with reasonable requests might be more comfortable in economy, where the atmosphere is less formal." The threat hung in the air, barely veiled. the suggestion that their resistance to discriminatory treatment was the real problem, and that they could be removed from first class if they didn't comply with demands that were clearly not being made of other passengers. Before any of the three women could respond, a passenger from row 3 stood up, a white man in his 70s, wearing a business suit, and his voice carried authority as he addressed Rebecca directly. "Excuse me, but I've been sitting here listening to this entire exchange, and what I'm hearing is clear racial profiling. You haven't asked any other passenger in this cabin to prove they paid for their seats. You haven't questioned anyone else's legitimacy. But the moment you saw 3 black women sitting together, you decided they must be breaking rules or cheating the system. That's not security protocol, that's discrimination, and I'll be providing a formal complaint to your airline management." Other passengers began nodding and murmuring agreement, several pulling out phones to record. And Rebecca's confident expression started to crack as she realized the cabin had turned against her, that her behavior had been witnessed and was being documented by people who recognized it for what it was. Angela finally spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying an edge that made Rebecca take an involuntary step backward. "Since you've made such a public spectacle of questioning our right to be here, I think it's only fair that we clarify exactly who we are and why your assumptions are not just offensive, but remarkably poorly timed. My name is Angela Chen, this is Natasha Williams, and this is Dr. Carmen Rodriguez. And together we are the founding partners of Skyward Equity Partners, a private equity firm that specializes in airline acquisitions and restructuring." She paused, watching Rebecca's face begin to change as the implications started to register. "Perhaps you've heard that Transglobal Airlines, the carrier we're currently flying on, recently underwent a leveraged buyout? That was us. We closed the acquisition 3 weeks ago, which makes us the majority shareholders and effective owners of this airline, the company that employs you, the aircraft you're standing in, and quite frankly, your continued employment prospects." The cabin went absolutely silent, every passenger frozen in place as they processed what they'd just heard, and Rebecca's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally a sickly pale realization that she'd just spent 10 minutes publicly humiliating and threatening to remove the 3 women who now owned the company she worked for. Dr. Rodriguez continued in that same calm, professorial tone, as if she were explaining a simple concept to a particularly slow student. "We're on our way to Seattle for our first board meeting as majority owners, where we'll be reviewing operational procedures, customer service protocols, and employee performance metrics. And I have to say, this experience is giving us excellent insight into some of the cultural problems we'll need to address, specifically the apparent comfort that some employees feel in engaging in racial profiling and discriminatory treatment of passengers based purely on assumptions about who looks like they belong in premium cabins." Natasha pulled out her phone and placed a call that connected immediately, and she spoke loud enough for the cabin to hear. "David, it's Natasha Williams. We're on flight 2847, and we've just experienced an incident where one of the flight attendants has spent the past 10 minutes questioning our right to be in first class, demanding additional proof of payment beyond our boarding passes, threatening to move us to economy, and making it quite clear that she believes 3 black women traveling together must be breaking rules or cheating the system. I need you to pull the cabin footage and prepare a full report on this employee's history, specifically any previous complaints about discriminatory behavior that might have been inadequately addressed." She listened for a moment, then added, "Her name is Rebecca Morrison, and yes, I want her removed from this flight immediately and suspended pending investigation. We're not even officially at our first board meeting yet, and we're already identifying exactly the kind of systemic bias that our due diligence suggested was creating reputation and liability issues for this airline." Rebecca had gone from pale to gray, and her voice came out as a desperate whisper. Ms. Williams, Miss Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, I apologize. I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" Angela cut her off with a look that could have frozen water. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? You're only apologizing because you've learned we have power over your employment, not because you recognize that what you did was wrong regardless of who we are. You shouldn't need to know someone's net worth or their position in the corporate hierarchy to treat them with basic dignity and respect. Every passenger on this aircraft deserves courtesy and professionalism, but you decided that 3 black women didn't warrant that treatment until you learned we could fire you." The lead flight attendant had appeared, summoned by Rebecca's increasingly panicked radio calls, and his face showed he'd already been briefed on who these passengers were and how catastrophically his colleague had mishandled the situation. "Ms. Williams, Miss Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, I'm Michael Sanders, the purser on this flight, and on behalf of Transglobal Airlines, I want to apologize unreservedly for the treatment you've received. This is completely unacceptable and does not reflect our values or our training standards." Natasha looked at him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating his competence in real time. "Michael, here's what concerns me most about this situation. Rebecca felt comfortable engaging in obvious racial profiling in a cabin full of witnesses, which suggests she either believed it was acceptable behavior or believed there would be no consequences for it. Both possibilities point to systemic failures in training, accountability, and culture that we're going to need to address urgently. So I want Rebecca removed from this flight. I want every member of this crew interviewed about what they witnessed and whether they've seen similar behavior from her or other employees. And I want a comprehensive review of how complaints about discriminatory treatment are currently handled, because I suspect they're being buried rather than investigated." Michael nodded, his face showing the stress of managing a crisis that could define how the new ownership team viewed the entire organization's competence. "All of that will be done immediately. Rebecca, you're relieved of duty. Please gather your belongings and deplane. You will not be working this flight or any other until our investigation is complete." As Rebecca was escorted away, visibly shaking and crying, several passengers approached Natasha, Angela, and Carmen to express support and offer witness statements. And the man who'd first spoken up introduced himself as Richard Morrison, an retired airline executive who said he'd be happy to consult with them on implementing better anti-discrimination training if they wanted experienced industry perspective. The flight continued with a different crew member serving first class, and Natasha found herself reflecting on how this incident perfectly encapsulated why they'd been drawn to acquire this airline in the first place. The numbers were good, the routes were profitable, the fleet was modern, but their due diligence had uncovered patterns in customer complaints and employee lawsuits that suggested deep cultural problems that previous management either ignored or actively enabled. And fixing those problems wasn't just about being good people. It was about protecting their investment and building a company that could attract and retain diverse customers in an increasingly competitive market where reputation mattered as much as price and convenience. When they landed in Seattle, there was a delegation that waited that included the interim CEO they'd appointed, the Chief Human Resources Officer, and several board members, all looking appropriately concerned about the incident and eager to discuss how to prevent similar situations. But Angela addressed them with the same quiet intensity she'd used on Rebecca. "This isn't going to be fixed with one firing and some statements about values. We need systemic change. Mandatory anti-bias training that's actually effective rather than checkbox compliance exercises. Anonymous reporting systems for discrimination complaints that bypass immediate supervisors who might protect problem employees. Regular audits of service interactions to identify patterns of disparate treatment. And most importantly, a culture where employees understand that discriminating against passengers will result in immediate termination, rather than warnings that allow behavior to continue. We bought this airline because we saw potential, but we're not going to watch our investment get destroyed by employees who think racial profiling is acceptable as long as they're polite about it. What you just witnessed wasn't just about three successful women being questioned about their tickets. It was about how black women specifically face compounded bias that assumes they're less competent, less wealthy, less deserving of premium treatment than any other demographic. About how their achievements are constantly diminished and their presence in elite spaces is treated as suspicious or fraudulent until proven otherwise. Natasha Williams, Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, and Angela Chen built a private equity firm successful enough to acquire an entire airline. They had the financial sophistication and industry knowledge to identify undervalued assets and restructure them for profitability. They had track records that would impress any investor or board member, but none of that protected them from being treated as potential fraudsters by a flight attendant who looked at their skin color and decided they couldn't possibly belong in first class legitimately. Think about Rebecca's assumptions and how quickly she made them. Three black women traveling together must be cheating the system, must be using someone else's miles, must need additional scrutiny that white passengers don't receive. And when challenged, she doubled down by threatening to move them to economy and suggesting they weren't sophisticated enough for the formal atmosphere of first class. Every word revealing layers of bias about who deserves respect and who deserves suspicion, who gets believed and who gets interrogated. The devastating irony that Rebecca demanded proof of legitimacy from the women who literally owned the company she worked for perfectly illustrates how bias operates independently of reality, how people's preconceived notions about race and class override actual evidence, how discrimination persists even when it makes no logical sense because it's based on feeling and prejudice rather than fact and observation. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that anger when Rebecca questioned the women's tickets, and that satisfaction when her assumptions backfired spectacularly, use those feelings to examine your own biases about who seems successful, who seems like they belong in elite spaces, who seems like they might be breaking rules versus who gets the benefit of the doubt. Share this video because it illustrates that black women face unique challenges navigating professional spaces where they're simultaneously expected to be exceptional and treated as if their achievements must be fraudulent, where they're judged more harshly and scrutinized more carefully than anyone else. Comment below with your own experiences of having your legitimacy questioned in spaces you'd earned access to, of being treated as suspicious when others were treated as welcome, of having to prove yourself in ways that others never do, because documenting these patterns makes it harder for institutions to dismiss them as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Subscribe if you believe that respect shouldn't be contingent on knowing someone's net worth or corporate position, that airline employees who engage in racial profiling should face immediate consequences, not internal investigations that protect perpetrators, that the next generation of black women entrepreneurs and executives deserves to travel and work and exist without constantly having to prove they have a right to occupy the spaces their achievements have earned them. And most importantly, be Richard Morrison. Be the passenger who speaks up when you witness discrimination, who offers to provide witness statements and expert testimony, who refuses to let these moments pass silently because your validation and support can transform victims' isolated experiences into documented patterns that demand institutional accountability and cultural transformation. Natasha, Carmen, and Angela will use this incident to drive real change in the airline they now own. And the question is whether the rest of us will do our part to challenge bias wherever we encounter it, rather than waiting until victims happen to be billionaires who can force consequences that should be automatic for everyone.